before we do that, I want to talk about an important stat, right? So typically you would, maybe spend half a day on making the presentation, but the investor on average will spend, less than 3 minutes on actually analyzing the pitch deck. DocSend, which is a popular platform uh, to use, has this data at around 2 minutes 42 seconds roughly, right? So you're being judged within that time frame. Now, this when you read this stat, this can be very it could mislead you to think that what this means is that your pitch deck has to be very flashy or it has to be very crisp, in the sense that you need to grab the investor's attention in a very short period of time. What I'd like to emphasize on is that this is an average, right? So the 2 minutes 30 seconds is an average that the investor will spend. Basically, if I am an investor and if I'm spending less than a minute on your pitch deck, you're not probably going to get the meeting, right? But if I'm spending more than 5 minutes, up to 10 minutes, that means that the pitch deck has done its job in gaining my interest, right? And that most likely results in a meeting. Right? So your objective via the pitch deck is to get into the second camp, right? That how do you incentivize the investor to spend more time on your deck? What that means is that the deck has to be insight heavy, right? You need to talk in your own voice. You need to be able to communicate your ideas very clearly and in a very concise manner as well, right? So that's what we're going to focus on in today's session. I'm going to give you a framework, right, that we use at Malpani Ventures. So it's a very simple PAT5 framework that we call. It draws upon popular terms in startup lingo. So PAT5 is problem, answer, TAM, technology, timing, team, and traction. Right. So we'll elaborate on each letter. Typically, I prefer this order as well for the pitch deck, because what this results is that it creates a structure for you to work with during the pitch deck and ensures that you don't miss out on any point. So typically what I'd like to see in a pitch deck is the problem slide first, right? So what you're trying to answer is what are you trying to fix? Typically, especially as young founders, the problem that I see is that a lot of the pitch decks will focus on the sector rather than the problem, right? So if you are, say, preparing or you're building something for the healthcare sector, I don't want the pitch deck to say that I'm going to fix Indian healthcare, right? I would like you to say that, I'm preparing a SaaS platform which works for nurses in ICU centers, for elderly patients, right? So you've got to be very narrow with your problem definition. And it matters because, if you've not gotten narrow, it means that you've not researched your problem well enough. So what works and what doesn't work in this slide is typically, when you go vague, right? Like when you're trying to make very broad-ended statements that don't really attract the investor's attention. Typically, your first slide is what catches the investor's eye. So you want to lead with a stat, right? So if you say that 95% of ultrasounds in India are not manufactured locally, right? So now that's a stat that I'm interested in, right? And then I want to understand what you're doing to solve for it, right? So there has to be one leading indicator that makes your business viable, and that makes me as an investor interested in understanding what you're building. Secondly, what I'd like to say is that you've got to do the work of speaking to potential customers. So let's say you're, continuing on the same example, that if you're building for nurses at ICU centers, then you should have actually spoken to at least 10, 15, 20 hospitals, right? And should come up with a point of view from their lens, right? So the problem statement should not feel theorized, right? It should feel as if it is lived from the customer's end, right? So if you're describing a Kirana wala's problem, describe the Kirana wala's Monday morning, right? Don't try to theorize how does the Kirana wala operate on a Monday, right? You have to actually spend maybe 4 or 5 Mondays with the Kirana wala if you've got to come up with a good problem slide. Lastly, what I'd like to leave you guys with for this slide is that don't focus on the size of the problem in this slide, right? There is a temptation to say, okay, this is a very big problem. What I'd like to see, or any investor likes to see, is the acuteness of the problem, right? That if this is a deep burning problem, then it makes a business much more viable, right? So if the problem is something that is felt every day by a potential customer, then he's more likely to pay for it. So that is the point you want to emphasize in this slide. The next slide obviously is going to be your solution. So the way to frame this is that, if you've defined the problem well enough, then the solution has to feel fairly obvious, right? So the first slide essentially leads on to the second slide. Again, now, as young founders, there is this ambition, to maybe you're building a SaaS platform, right, which is effectively a payroll solution, right? But you want to call it the operating system for restaurants, right? So you like to use these grand words that you pick up, reading Y Combinator, A16Z, whatever you guys read, right? And but what that results is that the investor feels that there's a disconnect, and it feels artificial in the sense that you're not actually describing what you're building today, right? So there is a way to get into your vision without diluting the actual reality of your business today. Secondly, the thing I see a lot is that a lot of young founders will try to use a lot of jargon to make it sound that they've understood the industry well, right? So nothing could be worse than you using jargon which the investor does not understand. So you would want to simplify it to the extent possible. Now, some of you here may be more technical guys. So one of the questions that we get is that how technical should the deck be? Right? So a simple rule of thumb is to say that if you are pitching to, or if you're talking to a smart person whom you respect, but who's not from within your industry, how would you describe your problem and your solution, right? That's how the pitch deck should read like, right? It should be legible enough for a smart person to understand, but it should not be very jargon heavy or very domain specific that someone outside of your industry doesn't get it at all. Right? That's the whole context. Lastly, again, here I emphasize, or I re-emphasize on being narrow, right? So what I'd like to see is that if your feature solves a very specific problem, then that is much more valuable than a platform that theorizes a lot of problems, right? Like, so if you lead from the problem and you can demonstrate a solution that actually solves for it, right? So if you demonstrate a before and after scenario, then that makes a world of a difference in convincing the investor that this is the right solution for something like this.